Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is a great turnout this evening for our event. My name is Niall O'Dowd. I'm the Dean of Arts here at the University, and I've been asked to represent the President, Professor Ciarán Ó'Hugartig, in welcoming you to this evening's event, a discussion of Trump, Irish America and the New Right, and it's organised by the Moore Institute and the Office of the President. The Moore Institute and the University are delighted to host this event, which is part of a series of public discourses on important topics facing the world, and we've had quite a number of them over the last couple of years. But I think this is probably one of the biggest, and I guess reflecting the calibre of the speakers we have and the importance of the topic that we're talking about. We've two very distinguished speakers, Maureen Dowd and Niall O'Dowd, and a very knowledgeable and experienced panel that are going to focus on the discussion. I'd like to hand you now over to Professor Dan Carey, who's the director of the Moore Institute, and to thank him and to other colleagues for organising this evening. I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Cathal, and thanks everybody for being here. It's great to see such a good crowd. This event sprang from the rather obvious and intriguing emergence of Irish Americans on the right, who form such an important part of Trump's cabinet. I think that most people in Ireland tend to think of Irish Americans as being on the Democratic side of things. They're thinking of John F. Kennedy and his brothers, probably of Tip O'Neill, even maybe Chicago Mayor Richard Daley. But not, and to a less extent, Ronald Reagan. Reagan is probably an important figure. We might even come to him at certain stages in our discussion tonight as an alternative Irish-American figure. So the Trump administration has brought about this marked change. That's one of the things that we wanted to think about. So who are the sorts of people we're talking about? Well, Steve Bannon, the former advisor, the ex-National Security Advisor Michael Flynn, the departed press secretary Sean Spicer. There has been a high casualty rate in the Trump administration, but his current confidant, Kellyanne Conway, his chief of staff, General John Kelly, the budget director, Mick Mulvaney, and White House counsel Donald F. McGahn. And then, of course, we have the Republican leadership, particularly with Paul Ryan, but also the House Majority Leader Kevin McCarthy. And then if we think of the news media, and they have a very close relationship with Trump, obviously Bill O'Reilly and Sean Hannity, and they've led the way in doubling down, if you like, on this vocal conservative agenda. Now, there are plenty of Irish Americans on the Democratic side. They tend to not have quite the same level of prominence, although certainly Joe Biden is an interesting figure to think about. So we want to try to think about that phenomenon tonight, try to work our way through it, and I'm very much looking forward to the discussion. We're fortunate to have two wonderful speakers to kick our discussion off, so I'll introduce both of them now. And the first person I want to introduce is Maureen Dowd. Maureen is known to us well here because she received an honorary degree from NUI Galway in 2012. She is very well known as a columnist for the New York Times. She won the 1999 Pulitzer Prize for distinguished commentary on Bill Clinton's impeachment woes. She became a columnist on the op-ed page in 1995. Before that, for a decade, she had been correspondent in the paper's Washington Bureau, and she was a White House correspondent under Bush the first, put it that way, and Clinton. She's covered 9 U.S. presidential elections. But as well as that, the Irish peace referendum, elections in France and England, and she's written extensively on these countries as well as Saudi Arabia. She's reported on gender issues around the world for 30 years. She's the author of a number of books, Bush World, Are Men Necessary? The Year of Voting Dangerously, The Derangement of American Politics. And she's received a number of awards over the course of a very distinguished career. We're delighted to have Maureen here this evening. Our second speaker will be Niall O'Dowd. Niall is a native of Tipperary, a founder of the Irish Voice newspaper, of Irish America magazine, and irishcentral.com, which has 3 million users every month. He was awarded an honorary doctorate by his alma mater, UCD, for his role in the Irish peace process. He has acted as a mediator between Sinn Féin and the White House, and he was also awarded the Presidential Award for Distinguished Service by President Michael D. Higgins in 2015. He's an adjunct professor at the Columbia School of Journalism. He's been there from 2010 to 2012. He also founded the Irish Lobby for Immigration Reform and has lobbied for over 2 decades for what he calls a fair and principled immigration policy in the U.S. Presumably that's becoming more difficult just now. very much looking forward to the contributions of our speakers, and we'll begin with Maureen Dowd. Maureen.
Can you guys hear me? Yes? I love being called Dr. Dowd. It makes me feel smarter. The first Irish American to become a Republican senator was John Danaher from Connecticut in 1938. As the story goes, an Irish Catholic woman breathlessly told her friend, "Have you heard the news? John Danaher has become a Republican." The friend replied, "It can't be true. I saw him at Mass just last Sunday." Yet now the Trump White House is chock-a-block with Irish names, including Vice President Pence, whose grandfather immigrated from Ireland in 1923 to Chicago and became a bus driver. The grandfather was a Democrat, and Pence's parents and 5 siblings idolized John Kennedy. But Pence had a religious experience in college and became an evangelical Christian and a Republican. So, how do we explain this narrative arc? When Irish immigrants got off the boat, seeking out the parish and the precinct and the pub, they found a natural home with the Democratic Party in the big cities, buoyed by the social services that kept them going and helped them make it to the next day in America. They became policemen and firemen and voted how the ward bosses and union bosses ordered, and began to get involved in politics themselves on the Democratic side, having the advantage of speaking the mother tongue as they moved into the mainstream. In the mid-19th century, when Tammany Hall, the Democratic machine, was reigning, a New York diarist wrote, "Our rulers are partly American scoundrels and partly Celtic scoundrels. The Celts are predominant, however, and we submit to the rod and scepter of Maguires and O'Tooles and O'Shanes." I grew up in a working-class family that reflected the political transformation that many Irish Catholics in America lived through. My father, Mike Dowd, a police inspector born in Ballyvaughan in Clare, was so proud of Al Smith, the first Catholic nominee of a party, elevated by the Democrats in 1928 when Smith was the half-Irish, half-Italian governor of New York, that my dad kept a big green scrapbook of all the newspaper coverage. In 1959, when a skinny young senator named John F. Kennedy took on Richard Nixon, my dad wasn't sure at first. He was in charge of security at the Senate and knew both men. He liked Richard Nixon. But then Kennedy had to go make a speech in Dallas to appease the Protestant bishops who thought that there would be a tunnel between the White House and the Vatican if JFK was elected, that the Pope would be calling the shots. My father hated the fact that JFK had to grovel about his religion, so he switched back to backing Kennedy. The Irish Catholic vote started drifting away in 1956, when Adlai Stevenson, known as an egghead, ran against Eisenhower. As Daniel Patrick Moynihan wrote in a letter to one of his Harvard professors about the working class and lower class Irish vote in New York that year, quote, "I found to my shock that it was not the Republicans who had rejected Adlai Stevenson, but the Democrats, who had profoundly lost confidence in the principles of foreign policy, even of public and social policy, which most liberals regard as essentially self-evident and substantially unquestioned." Stevenson had in fact attracted a significant vote from the professional and upper elements that normally vote Republican, but he lost Brooklyn and the Bronx in droves. But after what Moynihan called the dreary years of McCarthyism, JFK brought the Irish vote back. Even though Kennedy and Stevenson stood for the same things, Moynihan wrote, they trust Jack, they like him, they want him to win. The memory of Al Smith, Moynihan said, was still cruelly alive, and Moynihan even suggested that the support for Joe McCarthy's ruthless attack on the WASP establishment and the pinstripe State Department was really a kind of hidden, belated revenge for Al Smith's loss to Franklin Roosevelt, whom the Irish considered a snot-nosed Yankee from Groton and Harvard. The high-water mark of Irish Catholic involvement in American politics was 1960. Kennedy was elected president, John McCormick was the speaker, Mike Mansfield, with both parents born in Ireland, was the Democratic Senate Majority Leader. As the historian John Meacham told me, Jack Kennedy was this movie star, good-looking guy who suddenly made being Irish Catholic sexy. But then came that fateful year, 1968. Bobby Kennedy got assassinated. Anti-Vietnam demonstrations on campus and hippie flower power bloomed. Chicago's Mayor Richard Daley, the biggest Irish power broker of the 50s and early 60s, presided over violent clashes between war protesters and police at the 1968 convention. And that is where Mayor Daley gave his famous malapropism. The policeman is not here to create disorder. The policeman is here to preserve disorder. The Irish did not like hearing soldiers called baby killers and policemen called pigs. As the daughter of a cop, I can tell you that from personal experience. Many Irish Americans felt the country was too permissive and that integration was happening too fast. They couldn't relate to George McGovern and his coterie of long-haired movie stars like Warren Beatty and Jane Fonda. By 1970, as Moynihan wrote in his seminal book, Beyond the Melting Pot, the mass of the Irish have left the working class and in considerable measure the Democratic Party as well. Richard Nixon did very well with the Irish American voters in 1972 by getting Northern ethnic voters uneasy about civil rights and a lot of social issues and chipping them away from their previous Democratic allegiance. In 1973, Roe versus Wade drove more Irish Americans into the Republican embrace. As Andrew O'Haher wrote, many Irish Americans who arrived in America as despised outsiders traded the politics of class for the politics of race, moving from the New Deal coalition to Archie Bunker land, from FDR to Reagan to Donald Trump. After absorbing so much bigotry themselves, the Irish developed a strain of bigotry. After suffering through the pain of the No Irish Need Apply era, many decided they wanted to pull the drawbridge up after them. As the History News Network put it, the loudmouth likes of Bill O'Reilly, Sean Hannity, Pat Buchanan, and Steve Bannon are direct descendants from Joe McCarthy, with his gift for lurid innuendo and theatrical outrage against the conventional power elites. Buchanan gave his incendiary wave the pitchforks culture war speech at the 1992 Republican convention. Liberal columnist Molly Ivins quipped that it probably sounded better in the original German. And Bannon, whose saber rattles about a war with China, got out those same anti-elitist pitchforks for the Trump revolution in 2016. Both Buchanan and Bannon have a strong identification with the Confederacy. Bannon, who grew up in Richmond as a self-described Kennedy freak, calls himself a son of the South. Buchanan has a life-size portrait of the Confederate General Robert E. Lee in his home. You can draw a line from McCarthy's heinous fabricated list of 273 communist names in the State Department to Donald Trump's heinous fabricated birther attack on Barack Obama, implying that he was a Kenyan Muslim infiltrator. Robert Schmull, a professor of Irish studies at Notre Dame, described it to me this way. As Irish Americans came into clover economically, many decided to abandon the Democratic Party. They became more conservative, and in the twinkling of a generation, allegiances shifted from John Kennedy to Ronald Reagan for a sizable number of Irish. Add to that the pro-choice outlook of a majority of Democrats, and you can see why Irish Catholics turned their backs on the party that had been their ethnic political home since the time of the Great Hunger in the middle of the 19th century. If liberal JFK was peak Irish, the right-wing demagogue Joe McCarthy was the nadir. Even though the two men were friends and McCarthy went on dates with two of Jack's sisters and hired Bobby Kennedy as a staff lawyer for his Senate subcommittee on investigations into communists in Hollywood and the State Department. Then Senator Jack Kennedy stayed in the hospital after back surgery longer than he needed to, just so he could avoid the Senate vote to censure McCarthy. 20 years after JFK, things had flipped. The next Irish president, Ronald Reagan, was a Protestant and a Republican. The National Review, the leading conservative magazine, was led by William F. Buckley. Reagan formed a good working relationship with the Democratic Speaker of the House, Tip O'Neill, just a couple of Irish boyos. My dad had passed away by then, but my mom followed Reagan into the Republican Party. She was a fangirl. She loved everything about President Reagan, his optimism, his wit, his tough-on-crime patriotic message, the way he looked in a tuxedo. Jimmy Carter won the evangelicals, but Reagan split the Catholic vote. Reagan Democrats were born. For his re-election, he overwhelmingly won the Catholic vote. Reagan's great-grandfather was from Ballyporeen, but he played down his Irish roots, preferring to be seen as an English wasp when he was running for president. But during his presidency, the tie between Reagan and the Irish was so strong that when they built the Reagan Library, they dismantled the pub in Ballyporeen where Reagan drank a Smithwick's ale and moved it piece by piece, including the beer taps, to the Reagan Library in Simi Valley, California. Bill Clinton played a decisive role in achieving peace in Northern Ireland and had a lot of top Irish advisors, even though he never did manage to track down any relatives in Ireland. President Obama traced his mother's family back to great-great-great-grandfather Falmouth Kearney, a shoemaker in Moneygall who immigrated to Ohio in 1805. Obama also had a lot of Irish names in his top circle. Among them, Joe Biden, Bill Daley, Dennis McDonough, Shayla Murray, John Brennan, Jake Sullivan, and the flame-haired flamethrower Samantha Power. Donald Trump's mother was a theatrically sort of over-the-top strawberry blonde from the, Hebrides in Scotland, who once asked, "What kind of son have I created?" He had had just as many Irish around him. The departed Steve Bannon and Michael Flynn, and the remaining Pence, John Kelly, Kellyanne Conway, and Mick Mulvaney, and his allies in Congress, Paul Ryan and Kevin McCarthy. Another odd Irish connection comes from Trump's once lover and now foe, porn star Stormy Daniels, who owns a horse bred in Wicklow called Cooley Renaissance Man. Neil was upset when he found out that Stormy had an Irish horse starring in a porn movie and it wasn't one of his. The Gelding made its movie debut with Stormy in a porn film called Unbridled, about, quote, the heartbreaking world of equestrian competition, unquote. As Eileen Markey wrote in the New Republic, the history of Irish America, famished and haunted, is filled with characters who look outward from their Irishness, who stood, sometimes fiercely, for the outsider and the exploited, who could see their plight in the struggles of other peoples. Yet many Irish Americans have adopted Trump's brand of nativism, as well as an every man for himself faith in the market and a tight-heartedness that would have been anathema to our grandparents. Trump and Bill O'Reilly are still pals. They like to angrily drink vanilla milkshakes together. And the pugnacious Sean Hannity, an anchor on Fox News, is now considered Trump's top advisor outside of his family. He calls the president every night after his show so they can gossip and discuss something of supreme importance to both of them: ratings. There have been comparisons made between Donald Trump and Joe McCarthy, and not just because both used the infamous Roy Cohn as a lawyer. Consider the way John Meacham described Joe McCarthy in his new book, The Soul of America, The Battle for Our Better Angels. Quote, "McCarthy was a master of false charges, of conspiracy-tinged rhetoric, and of calculated disrespect for conventional figures. McCarthy could distract the public, play the press, and change the subject, all while keeping himself at center stage. McCarthy loved the story of himself as the brave warrior. He was fantastic copy, a real-life serial. The twists and turns of the McCarthy saga meant more bylines for the reporters, more exciting headlines for the editors, more copies sold for the owners. Radio and television amplified McCarthy's impact," unquote. Trump became president with the help of what he called the forgotten Americans. Steve Bannon, whose father was an AT&T lineman in Richmond, described the Trump movement to me when I called him about this speech as, quote, "people who punched out of the system and guys serving in the military, people who are the backbone of civic society in America, coaching Little League, supporting the church, working class Scotch-Irish in the South, and blue-collar Irish Catholics in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Michigan. Hammerhead mix, or as Hillary calls them, deplorables," unquote. The stunning, that's what I call my Republican family, my little basket of deplorables. The stunning Trump triumph was fueled by people who wondered why their children weren't growing up in the same country that they did, and why their children were likely to do worse than they did, and why the East Coast and West Coast had forgotten about them. Bannon ran Breitbart News, which gave voice to the alt-right. The favorite insult of the alt-right is to call someone a cuck, as in cuckold. And the way a rich guy who lived in a golden penthouse on Fifth Avenue, like Donald Trump, connected with the angry working class voters was the theme of being cuckolded, that America was being taken for a ride on trade and immigration issues. Trump has had his alt-right moments, making the unforgivable comment after Charlottesville residents clashed with neo-Nazis in a deadly march last summer that there was, quote, "blame on both sides," unquote. As they opened the embassy in Jerusalem yesterday with carnage at the border, Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump absurdly brought two religious bigots with them. Pastor John Hagee is one of America's most prominent preachers about the coming of the apocalypse, and once said that Hitler was sent by God to drive Jews to their ancestral homeland. Also along for the ride was a Southern Baptist pastor named Robert Jeffress, who once said that President Obama was paving the way for the Antichrist. Yeah, they were part of the presidential entourage. Professor Schmull told me, quote, "As American politics keeps veering to extremes, the GOP Irish aren't immune to occupying space on the far right," unquote. My friend Neil explained Trump's appeal to Irish Americans succinctly in his publication, Irish Central. Quote, "Trump seemed a relatively simple solution, the sheriff riding in to clean up the town, except his faults were studiously overlooked. Underpinning it all was the belief that America today is fading fast due to over-intrusion by government, too many handouts, minority mollycoddling, and a fear of saying the wrong thing. Hillary may have helped her husband bring peace to Northern Ireland, but as Niall, a Hillary fan, conceded, her analytical and deeply intellectual mindset, her air of floating above it all and dismissing the white working class as unimportant, refusing to address concerns on gay marriage, turning down an invitation to speak at Notre Dame, clashed with the raw, bare-boned appeal of Trump. Not all of Trump's supporters are racist. They're like my brothers and nephews, just polo shirt and khakis, golf club, Knights of Columbus, Friendly Sons of St. Patrick conservatives who can't stand political correctness and being talked down to by liberals. They are thrilled to have Neil Gorsuch on the Supreme Court, to have a tax cut, even a small one, to have regulations cut back. They were turned off by President Obama talking about how working class voters from Midwest industrial towns devastated by job losses bitterly cling to guns or religion or anti-immigrant sentiment. In a strange way, Ireland and America have changed places. As Ireland has jumped forward and grown more peaceful and worldly and European, America has reeled backwards, growing more fractious and tribal and insular. Americans have a sepia image of Ireland, frozen in time around the era of the Quiet Man, the John Ford movie with Maureen O'Hara, John Wayne, and Barry Fitzgerald. They still think of Ireland as conservative, religious, quaint place. Daniel Mulhall, the Irish ambassador in DC, told me that the image of Ireland is so out of date that when he visited Miami recently, a man there asked him to take a picture with the 3-foot-high leprechaun he had brought with him. The ambassador told the man, "I have to tell you that this is not how we see Ireland." Ireland did not support Brexit, but the Brexit states in America put Trump over the top. Unlike the feeling among Trump supporters who are having a hard time accepting that America is heading toward being a non-white majority country, there is no anti-immigrant sentiment in Ireland, no Eurosceptic element, no ugly populist far-right party, even when unemployment hit 15% and when 17% of the population here is born outside Ireland. There was a poll taken last week that said that 92% of people think that EU membership is good for Ireland. America is struggling now for a new identity. It used to be John Wayne as a frontier cowboy. We used to be strong and silent. Now we're weak and chatty. And thanks to the internet and the president, we're mean. With Trump, our world is changed utterly. But for all his debasement of the culture and the Constitution, Trump is having a clarifying effect on our civic society. Having a Batman cartoon villain who might blow up the world in the Oval Office has revived many important institutions in America: journalism, feminism, liberalism, the ACLU, late-night comedy, shrinks, bars. And certainly he is a boon to columnists, especially Irish-American ones. So thank you, President Trump, and thank you, Galway University.
Thank you, Maureen. That was wonderfully illuminating. I'm reminded when Reagan was elected, that immediate search for his forebears, and it was found that he could be traced back to Brian Boru with a few gaps. Niall, could I welcome you to the podium?
You know, speaking after the most influential columnist from the most influential newspaper in the world is like being Elizabeth Taylor's 8th husband. I know what to do, but you won't get very excited. I think one of the things that is most interesting to me, I'll just read you a quote. Journalist Noah Brooks informed his readers The President has succeeded in getting about him a corps of attachés of Hibernian descent whose manner and style are about as disagreeable as can be. There's McManus, Burke, Forbes, Burns, O'Leary, Mangan, McGee, Pender. The list just goes on. The President was Abraham Lincoln. Not somebody we would normally associate with the Irish. But in fact, to Maureen's point, there's been Irish on the Republican side right from the very beginning. Different than the Republican Party today, but the fact is that with 35 million people, if all of us agreed with the same politics, we'd be quite crazy. So in fact, it's not any great source of surprise to me that the Irish-American vote is usually split, and is split in the way that was obvious in the last election. The one thing I'd say about the last election is Hillary lost the last election, Trump didn't win it. And the reason Trump didn't win it was, as Maureen referred to, Hillary lost sight of the white ethnic Catholic vote, which was the critical vote that voted her husband in on 2 elections. And that was an extraordinary error given the fact that Bill himself made clear midway through the campaign that he felt that the white ethnic vote was not being listened to. And what you had was a bunch of people from the Obama administration who sliced and diced algorithms and came up with reasons why, as Maureen has recounted in one of her columns, laughed out loud at Bill's concern that they weren't reaching the white ethnic Catholics. So it was an inevitable result based on a terrible campaign rather than anything brilliant, in my opinion, that Trump did. Trump had the wrong solution, but Hillary had no solution. And that's why we're looking at a President Trump today. I think the Irish in his cabinet are about Catholicism more than Irish. I think people like Hannity and O'Reilly come from a background where they went to Catholic school, were deeply influenced by the mores of the Catholic schools of the 50s and 60s, and transferred that onto a political plane, particularly on issues like abortion. And I think that if you look at the all Catholic, all white, all Irish group around Trump at the moment, it's pretty similar. It's all harking back to a Catholicism where certainty was certain and everyone knew their place. What was interesting was why the Irish became Democrats to begin with. And it's not something that's fully understood. When they got off the boat, 20,000 a week during the aftermath of the famine, 20,000 a month getting off the boat, the Republicans sent the know-nothings after them. They were a racist gang who, in Louisville in 1865, burnt 21 Irish people to death rather than let them vote. So they had no choice but to join the Democratic Party. But it was inevitable as time went on that they would begin to shift over, particularly when in the 50s and 60s you began to see the appearance of very liberal Irish America, spearheaded by John Kennedy. But the interesting aspect that I find lately is talking to Ancestry DNA a lot about the Irish American heritage and the Irish American background, is that people choose Irish as their ancestry more than any other ancestry in their records. In other words, if you're Irish and Italian, Irish and Indian, Irish and German, you'll emphasize the Irish part. And that goes right back to the part of where the Irish were, through John F. Kennedy, the most admired people in the United States. That's not the case anymore, and I think it's pretty obvious to a lot of people that we've gone down the wrong road. But if you look at the vote that Trump actually got from, it's never been broken down into Irish Catholics, it's been broken down into Catholic. 56% of the Catholic vote he got. But he got 53% of the white women's vote, which is the one that really stuns me when I think about it, that 53% of white women actually voted for Donald Trump to be president. But Irish America today is very different to Irish America back then in the Kennedy era. And the relationship with Ireland is very different. 80% of Irish Americans, according to a survey we did in Irish Central of 3,000 Irish Americans, get their news from social media. There are 28 flights every night from America to Ireland. The fact that there's so much interaction between the two countries has led to the reality that for a lot of Irish Americans, I probably disagree somewhat with Maureen on this, that they understand and know Ireland a lot better than they did in previous generations. And I think that's particularly true of the big issues like Brexit, like the abortion referendum. You will get a lot of discussion in Irish American circles that's not necessarily partisan, but quite interested and informed and involved. And the reason that they would hesitate to to basically say that Ireland is an amazing place altogether is they know their own history, that every 30 years people are kicked out of this country because of economic crisis. You go back in the 20s, the 50s, the 80s, 2010, the way that Ireland dealt with the solution was to ask people to leave, or not ask them, but give them no choice but to leave. So I'm not one of those that thinks that modern Ireland is necessarily the best example to Irish America of what the Irish identity is. I think the Irish identity is different in every country you go to. If you go to Irish Australia, it's a very different identity. If you go to Irish in Britain, if you go to Irish in America. And the one thing I would want Americans to understand, or Irish people to understand, is just because you're born in the island of Ireland does not give you a lock on the definition of being Irish. That's a very, very important point to me, very, very important point to people who read my website, is their identity as Irish people was caused by a famine 160 years ago. They were forced to flee their country, but they've never forgotten their roots because they had to get off a boat somewhere in America and make a life for themselves. And that's the beauty of America, is that everybody starts a journey somewhere. Nobody was born in America except the American Indians. But everybody you talk to, Donald Trump's mother from the Isle of Skye, John F. Kennedy's people from Wexford, they all came on a ship or on a boat or on a plane. And it's an idea. America is an idea more than it is a country. And that's why when that idea is hijacked like it has been by Trump, it becomes extremely damaging. I went to a Trump rally myself early on in the campaign, and I was amazed at the number of people I knew at it, cops and firemen mostly. And when I asked them why they were basically following Trump, who even at that point looked like a nut job to me, they were very clear that he was speaking to them, and Hillary wasn't. And that was true of the entire campaign, because Hillary was on a different level, surrounded by a phalanx of people who had delivered the White House to Obama and who thought that Hillary was Obama, when in fact she was a vastly inferior candidate. But Trump, to his credit, took that image on board of him being the working man's hero. And I'll always remember the last weekend of the campaign when Trump went around the country literally bringing his podium with him. You might remember John Major doing this in the British election, where he stood on a soapbox and against all the odds got elected. On that weekend, when the vote was finally coming together for him, he went to 8 different places, pulled his podium off the plane, got up and gave a speech. Hillary Clinton was listening to rock concerts by Bruce Springsteen. And the impact on people, even that weekend, I remember being very significant. She really thinks she has it. She's about to break out the champagne. She's way overconfident. And that was in fact what happened. I myself was as shocked as I've ever been that Trump won the election. But now it makes sense, because the country was at a place where people were actually quite desperate in parts of the country, particularly the parts called the flyover, where between Los Angeles and New York. And they wanted to make a point, and they wanted to make a point very firmly. Like the people in Brexit, if you understand them, they wanted to make a point. They didn't quite know where the point would go, and neither did the people in America who voted for Trump. But the fact is that it's not surprising in the end, because he paid attention to them, and they didn't, and the Hillary campaign did not pay attention to them. But I know we're going to come back, and if you look at the reality of Irish America, I think it's actually in a pretty good place. If you look at the Washington Post list of the 10 people who are likely to run for president in 2020 for the Democratic Party, there's Joe Biden, Irish; Joe Kennedy, Irish; Kristen Gillibrand, Irish; Senator Chris Murphy, Irish; Terry McAuliffe, Irish. It's 5 of the 10 leading contenders, according to the Washington Post, are Irish American. So the liberal Irish Americans are not going to go away. We're going to come back, and we're going to prove that Trump is an aberration, because that's the biggest question to come out of this election. Is he an aberration, or is he the future? I don't know the answer to that question, but right now, with his poll around 42, 43%, and you add in the 5% who never admit they vote for him, he's probably up around 47, 48, and he doesn't have that far to go. So don't be all that surprised if Donald Trump gets re-elected. It's definitely possible, but it needs a very strong candidate, and I happen to think it'll probably be one of the Irish names that will surface eventually to run against him. So when I talk about the Irish around President Trump, or the Irish around President Reagan, or the Irish around President Bush, they weren't all bad. President Bush had a very good guy called Richard Haas, who was the envoy to Northern Ireland, did an incredible job in Northern Ireland. We don't necessarily have to walk away because they're Irish and they're Republican. Many of them mean very well and want to work on behalf of Ireland and the Irish. So my closing words would be that Trump is there for 4 years, the Irish will be with him, but there's a hell of a lot of Irish getting together to go against him. And hopefully this time, whoever the candidate is, will listen to us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Neil. We are fortunate to have a panel of people who can speak to these issues and raise different points and questions. So we'll have some thoughts and comments from them. I'll introduce them in a moment, and then we'll have a chance to hear any questions that you might have. So I'll begin. We'll go alphabetically, and on my left is Kathleen Kavanagh. She's a socio-legal scholar. She's a lecturer in the Faculty of Law at the Irish Centre for Human Rights here at NUI Galway. She has a PhD in comparative politics from the London School of Economics. And she works largely on questions of nationalism, ethnic conflict, political violence, states of emergency, but also on narratives of Islamic law and rights, freedom of religion, and militant democracy. She's published various essays on Turkey in the Harvard Human Rights Journal and Human Rights Quarterly and other publications. Larry Donnelly, to her left, was born in Boston. He took his law degree there. He's been a lecturer and director of clinical legal education in the School of Law at NUI Galway since 2001. He'd probably be well known to people as a commentator. In addition to founding and directing the law school's clinical program, he teaches the legal skills modules to undergraduates. He's from a Boston family, as I mentioned, with Irish political interests. He was active in government and politics in Massachusetts, and he now contributes frequently to a wide range of media, including thejournal.ie and irishcentral.com. Eileen Glooly. Eileen is Executive Director of the Society of Fellows and the Heyman Center for the Humanities at Columbia University. I'm particularly delighted that she would make the trip, especially for this occasion from New York. Thank you, Eileen. She also has appointments in English and comparative literature and other institutes within the university. She's leading a Mellon Foundation project on justice and education, which aims to increase tertiary education opportunities for people who are incarcerated. In her spare time, if I can put it that way, she's a Victorian scholar with many publications to her name related to Dickens and other important figures in the period. And then Charlotte McIver, my colleague in drama. Charlotte is a lecturer in drama and theatre studies at NUI Galway. She's published a book on migration and performance in contemporary Ireland. She's co-edited 3 books on interculturalism and performance, on devised performance in Ireland, and plays and practitioner perspectives. So that's a quick introduction to our panelists, and this is not to preempt anyone's intervening and talking over one another and all that good stuff. But I want to begin, maybe Charlotte, if I could ask you to begin, if that's okay. And if I might ask you about questions of race and immigration, which did come up in both talks, and just to give your take on how that fits into this whole scenario of Irish-American conservatism, if you would.
I suppose I'll start by talking about my own personal experience and then maybe end just briefly addressing my research now on migration into Ireland. So I was born and raised in Northeast Philadelphia. I was born to a father from Dundalk who emigrated to the States to marry my mother, and a mother who was the daughter of Irish immigrants and German immigrants. The rise of the far right in Irish America is of no surprise to me, because indeed it's something that I lived from my earliest memories. My parents, my mother and my grandfather in particular, were quite virulent in their politics. We had copies of the Conservative Chronicle all over my grandfather's house. My mother had Rush Limbaugh on speed dial. And when we had days off from school or we were homesick, she would offer to give us money if we tried to call and get through to him so she could ask him a question. So the politics was around me all the time, and I experienced it as a child as quite ugly, as quite angry, something that didn't come up in Maureen's remarks, I suppose, as well as the anxiety around sexuality, around homosexuality, around the sexual scandal, of course, which you've written quite a lot about in the Clinton administration. The Clintons were a very hated set of figures in my household. And there was a lot going on in that moment, I think, in terms of an opening up of conversations around sexuality. The abortion question was huge, and I think is what ties my parents ultimately most strongly to the Republican Party. So actually now living here in Ireland as an Irish citizen with our upcoming referendum, I feel as if I'm reliving my childhood every time I walk down the street here, and that's quite a powerful thing. So where I grew up in Northeast Philadelphia, we were an area on the seam between middle class and working class. We really wanted to be middle class. We really identified as middle class and as Irish Americans. I was one of only 2 kids in my class who had a father actually from Ireland, but everyone very aggressively claimed and performed Irishness. And there's a really lovely term that Diane Negra has about this, where she talks about Irish as an ethnically insulated whiteness, as an identity that gives people license to kind of practice or say whatever they want because we were oppressed, we struggled, et cetera, et cetera. And I experienced a lot of anger around political correctness in my family and in my education growing up. So what came out during the Trump election really felt to me like it had risen to the surface from what felt like what it was going on within the context of the neighborhood I grew up in, the schools that I went to. And I think this is really ushered along in the States by the fact that, you know, segregation, I feel, in the United States is not a thing of the past. It's a thing of the everyday. There was a lot of anxiety about social housing coming into my neighborhood, what that would mean. So for me, the way that race and class are entangled together, you can never separate. And that's something that, you know, in analysis of this most recent election, I think is something we need to keep pushing on and looking at. It's been interesting then, moving here, looking at inward migration into Ireland, and I find that from my family in the United States, or from people who want to come over here and study within Ireland, and who have this kind of Irish-American fantasy, which I think still does exist, there's often a disappointment that people have, or a lot of questions I get about what it means that there's African-Irish people now. Well, there can't be. Polish-Irish, that's not actually an identity, that's our country. You know, what is happening there in your research? And I would say that there is a racism that exists within Irish society. We don't have a populist right party. It's a lot more subterranean, but I think you have to look no further than our maintenance of the direct provision system and very limited, meaningful attempts to reform or to change that, to find evidence of that. So I suppose that's my own personal trajectory.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. And one of the things that's interesting about that, it chimes with my own sense that Irish Americans identify with Republican positions really in relation to social issues,
Yeah.
rather than the fiscal conservatism, for which that's a different tradition and a different strand.
I would say it's entangled, though, because there is a fear that, well, I work for this, I'm going to get it taken away from me. Well, I emigrated. My father would say, well, I emigrated legally, you know, that I did it, so why can't these other people do it?
Yeah.
So it's entangled.
Yeah, Elaine, I wonder if I asked you, you might comment on that as well, but I think you had raised an issue about abortion as a particularly important galvanizing issue for Irish Americans, which may have taken them more in the direction of the GOP rather than the Democrats.
Well, I think one of the things that was surprising was how abortion, pretty much after, I guess, Roe v. Wade, and, you know, subterraneanly, and then in a greater sense as time went on, while it became the polarizing issue, and the Republicans, or one aspect of the Republican Party, really picked up on it. So reflecting on it, I mean, philosophically, it seems to me everybody's against abortion, right? It's just that it's not, you can't legislate a philosophical issue. If you could, we wouldn't have wars, because it's wrong to kill people, and especially innocent people. And so the fact that this has had such a, you know, it's a kind of, I hate to say trump card, but it is this sort of card that gets played that it's hard to say, you know. Of course you don't. I mean, I'm walking around Galway. I was surprised about the various, the posters, right? It was 1 out of 5 children are aborted in the UK, don't let it happen here, or something. So I think that, you know, that's sort of, it seems to me what it comes from. But the other thing, picking up what Charlotte said, was about where the Irish Americans are located in America, right? So in the cities in America vote Democratic. They are, you know, right? I mean, surprisingly, any city over 100,000 people votes Democratic, with 3 exceptions: Provo, Utah, Lubbock, Texas, and in this last election, Mesa, Arizona, right? So even in places like Texas, right, the Dallas or Austin or Houston, city proper, will vote Democratic. It seems to me that that has lots to do with the fact that cities are ethnically mixed. One of the things that happened, I think, by certain sorts of Irish identified Americans voted Republican is when they moved out of the city and then moved into basically ethnic enclaves. So Poughkeepsie, New York, upstate New York, or the suburbs of Rochester, New York, where I spent my first several years. I mean, my sort of story was that when I was 5 years old, I knew that on our street, everyone on our street was Irish Catholic, except for one German Catholic family, one Italian Catholic family, and one Protestant family. But I knew that right before school. It was part of the identity, and that continues to be the case in a place like Rochester or suburbs of Philadelphia. We were talking earlier when Charlotte was saying where she was from, and Fox Chase, the neighborhood is sort of next to a Jewish neighborhood, but is heavily identified as Irish Catholic and would vote Republican. So,
yeah, thank you. Let's take just, I think, an interesting question about the responsibilities of the Democratic Party. And Neil, in effect, you were alluding to that, but I wonder, Larry, if you might comment on, I guess there's different ways of framing the question, but one of them is this a Trump success or a Democratic failure or Hillary failure, as Neil was framing it? What's your take on this?
Well, I think that the trends that I think everyone else has spoken about, I think those are true. Certainly Irish America, there has been a drift away from the Democratic Party. There has been an embrace among Irish Americans of positions further to the right, and I think abortion is probably the issue on which that is most pronounced. But when you talk about the failings of the Democrat, and I think that was always going to be a reality. I think Neil talks about 35 million people. They're not going to agree on everything. So there was always going to be a drift. But it's a little bit like trade in the sense that the point is constantly made about the United States and trade that you can't stop globalization. People are just going to have to get with the program. Well, in terms of the Democratic Party, and what I would regard as its primary failing in this regard was it actually exacerbated the flight of Irish Catholics in particular from the party. The reason why, as I see it, and if you look at the Democratic Party platform over the years, it's effectively prioritized the ambitions of the cultural left to all of the other values the Democratic Party once stood for. And that has had a catastrophic impact, I think, on its receipt of the Catholic vote. And I think it's a big political failing. It doesn't make sense really at any level. So to my way of thinking, look, the United States, and this is crazy for people here to consider it, but the United States is a country of 320 million people. There are two mainstream or realistic political parties. As such, you have to have a big tent. And from a Democratic point of view, part of that big tent has to be accepting people who have different views on contentious issues like abortion. You're always going to lose some. That drift to the right is always there. But this is going back to my point on trade. Why take the view that we want to push them out, that we want to get them out and push them over to the right, rather than opening that tent up and making them feel welcome in the party?
Kathleen, it might be interesting to get your thoughts on this as well, because you've talked about Trump as an energizing force, and that this is, I suppose, in effect, an opportunity. I don't know, would you sort of agree with Larry there, that there's a rapprochement that's needed, which might imply a softening of certain kinds of positions, or what's your sense of what the political opportunity might be?
Well, I go back to what Maureen brought out in part of her lecture, which is that I think the United States right now, in terms of kind of civil society, is looking for identity. And I don't think either Hillary Clinton, certainly Hillary Clinton didn't offer a window on what that identity would be. And at the moment, in the face of Trump, and in the face of the loss of progressives to look in particular directions for how is it that we're going to see each other, or how are we going to respond to this threat, that identity is still being shaped and formed. And I find myself in the very unusual position of being the most optimistic person on this stage for a couple of reasons, one of which is that I think that there are signals within kind of civil society in the United States, they've been woken up from this dogmatic slumber, and that they are, if nothing else, capturing that public square. And it's not just about students that are, anti-gun and going on the street, but people are protesting, and they're protesting from small to medium-sized protests about a variety of different things. And I think if those dogmatic slumbers continue to be woken up, there's a political awakening of those who would not have necessarily seen voting as a necessity. We will see is change, and I think we're seeing it today in Pennsylvania. Hopefully, it's the primaries. You're seeing changes with court challenges to gerrymandering, and as much as I understand the kind of total disdain everyone has for Trump, I also think that this could be a Marxist acceleration moment, that you burn it down and something actually positive can grow from it.
The side of the story which you've raised, and it came up at various points in the discussion, is the position relative to the evangelical movement. And we do have an interesting figure like Pence and that personal story of migration. I was also thinking of James Comey as another example, raised in an Irish Catholic context, who's become a Methodist. I don't know quite in what context that happened. So is this really a story, and this is for everyone, is it really a story about the Catholic Church and its hold on a certain, is that a block vote of a kind? Is there a migration in Irish America towards different kinds of Protestant faith?
So what I'd say is that I grew up in a time when I continue to go to church, where there was and I think Maureen alluded to it, where there was a progressive Catholic theology and the liberation theology, but the Berrigans were big in my household. I had nuns that were so progressive that they lost their teaching contract out in Los Angeles the year I graduated. So I think that with Francis, I think that there's sort of a possibility for people who identify as Catholic to bring themselves to the progressive causes again. But I don't. This is slightly off the topic. But I was shocked. I'm shocked in America about the reaction amongst a lot of conservative Irish Catholics to Francis. Like they don't sort of even consider him a legitimate pope, which is astounding, right?
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, and one way of telling that story, I think, is possibly the difference between the two vice presidential candidates in 2016, Mike Pence and Tim Kaine. I think Kaine seems to be from that a kind of mission, Catholic mission background. And that's a major story in the U.S. generally, of that loss of social mission Christianity, regardless of what the confessional orientation is. I actually had a question for you, Maureen, and I'm interested in this whole question of a service ethic and that Catholic tradition. And I think it might be relevant possibly to the story you're telling about your father and being involved in the police. And I thought it was extremely interesting the point you made about an anti-police thing, which might galvanize us. And I'm thinking of, obviously, the people with the military background. You could think of Bannon in this context, or General Kelly. I think also maybe of James Comey as having, again, a distinctive service ethic, which I see as a Catholic trace. Would you go along with that? Do you recognize that?
Well, I'm not sure about that, but I do think the fascinating thing about James Comey is usually in Washington, people get in trouble for having an absence of rectitude, and James Comey got in trouble for having an overabundance of rectitude. Like he was so obsessed with doing the right thing and the image of himself as a guy with a white hat that he did the wrong thing. And we don't get that narrative very often in Washington. Yeah.
Actually, I was struck. I was in the U.S. When his interview with George Stephanopoulos went out, and people in Ireland would not have seen it. It was broadcast on ABC, although it is available on YouTube, and we're seeing. But I kept thinking to myself, altar boy.
Right.
A 6'8" altar boy,
Yes.
But an altar boy nonetheless. That there was that rectitude, I think, that you're alluding to.
Well, also it makes such an amazing contrast with Trump. Comey and Mueller are very much the straight arrow Boy Scouts. I mean, in Comey's case, he sort of stumbled over being a straight arrow. But, they are just straight ahead, and Trump is the ultimate con man who, has finessed his way into this job, but brought along a lot of flotsam and jetsam that is tripping him up.
Yeah. Larry, I might ask you about a question that hasn't come up, but I've been thinking about this. I'm wondering about the Irish relationship to organized labor. And the Reagan era was obviously the anti-union moment, and a successful one. And obviously the same thing went on in Britain and elsewhere. Did you have any thoughts on organized labor and the Irish relationship to that? And where are we in Irish America with that question?
Well, look, I mean, the labor movement in whole scale has scaled down considerably in the United States. It's no longer the force that it was in American politics, and certainly not within the Democratic Party. That said, you can probably all guess where I'm from, in my home city. In my home city, the Irish connection to the labor movement would be very strong, and indeed our mayor, son of Galway, Marty Walsh, rose through the ranks of organized labor to become the mayor of the city. And I think in terms of appealing, and in terms of what I was talking to about a little while ago about the Democratic Party, the reality is there's an awful lot of Irish American union guys and union girls who voted for Donald Trump. And they did so because he spoke their language on the issues that matter most to labor. And those would be things like trade. I mean, they would hear the giant sucking sound of jobs going south of the border in the wake of the NAFTA trade agreement. And these are things that the Democratic Party and the Republican Party alike, I suppose, endorsed in a big way. And I think what a lot of those Irish American and other ethnic groups who are still members of unions, they would find it very hard, and they would feel a real sense of abandonment. Remember, the Democratic Party, really one of its founding principles, people who work with their hands for a living and live paycheck to paycheck. A lot of those people would have felt abandoned. But here's where I have a note of optimism. Is somebody like Marty Walsh, who speaks their language, who's a progressive undeniably, but who speaks their language and can talk to ordinary men and women on the streets. There's awful lot of those people who cast ballots for Marty Walsh and also cast ballots for Donald Trump. It is the type of person, the type of politician, we're talking about 2020. I'm not saying Marty Walsh is necessarily the answer for the Democrats, but it is somebody who can reach out both to that group of people who feel disaffected and the Democratic coalition that's emerged in recent years. That's the answer for the Democratic Party.
Yeah. Well, I think that's, one of the issues, of course, is you have to find a candidate. And you can complain all you like, but you got to find a candidate. I've often thought about it. You need somebody who has got some personal appeal. That seems to be a constant, even if we're going back to Reagan. That's what tends to win elections. And it's the people who don't have any personal appeal who get stuck in different ways. I think Hillary very much ran as a competence candidate. And it's very hard to get people excited about that.
What we're forgetting, though, is that she did win the popular vote by quite a big margin, right? More than it happened in times past, right? And there were Russian bots, and there was voter suppression, and there was, and nobody, I don't think we've begun to scratch the surface of what social media and the transmission by social media has had for our culture generally, much less for this election, right? We analyze it from past elections, and it feels to me that we're in a total...
I think one of the things that Americans do know they made a mistake. I think that is a measure of the country that they know. If you look at the elections since Trump was elected, every election, every state election, every congressional election, every Senate election, the average gain by the Democratic candidate is 14 points, which is a huge gain. Now, I am not convinced they won't blow that, simply because of some of the reasons you were talking about there, Larry, that if they pick, like Conor Lamb is the classic guy for me, Pennsylvania, in a congressional district that Trump won by 20 points, he gets the union vote, he gets the NRA vote, and he beats his opponent by 2 points. So a 22-point turnaround. If the Democrats don't tailor their candidates to the issues in the districts and in the states, they will lose again. If they go with a kind of a, lefty, far left sort of candidate who says all the right things about all the right left-wing things, they will get defeated again. They need to pick a candidate and candidates who reflect the constituency and the congressional district that they're actually running in. That's absolutely critical.
Yeah. Just to put another name out there, he wouldn't be a candidate in 2020, but Beto O'Rourke, I think, is an interesting figure in Texas running against Cruz. And he seems like he might be of a new mold that could be an interesting proposition. I don't know whether you've followed him particularly or have an interest in.
I've met him. You know, he's got a hell of a race. If he beats that guy, then he's definitely presidential timber in my book.
Yeah.
But he'll spend a fortune against him.
Yeah.
Ted Cruz, sorry.
Yeah. I think it's now a chance to open the floor to questions and comments. Oh, I see a hand already. That's good. We have roving mics. There's just in the second row here. Thanks, Martha. Well, just wait for the microphone just a sec.
I don't wish to be rude, but somebody spoke about Polish Irish people and Black Irish people, and I don't see any on the panel. And I see academics, and I see everything but the working class.
This is a university, by the way, so that's one of the
on
reasons
this
why there are
panel.
academics present on the panel. But
And what I think is important about this is that people don't realize what a successful job the Republicans have done in America of convincing all whites, not just the Irish Americans, but all whites, that the problems aren't coming from the Betsy Vosses, the billionaire class. They're coming from the Black and the Latino people. And that's where your enemy is. And I just got off a 2-hour phone conversation with my sister, and I tell you...
no,
Can I just finish for a moment?
If you're endorsing racism, I have an issue with what you're saying. If you're making an observation about the kind of support that Trump is attracting, that's a relevant observation.
I think what nobody is realizing is that Trump has awoken a sleeping giant in America. It is the giant of hatred, of racism. It's the giant of economic disparity in America. White Americans are not going to go back to the Democratic Party because they know that that means accepting blacks.
Okay, I think we should move on at this point. I mean, you've made a troubling point. It's an important point because it tells us a lot about where America is at the moment, but let's move on to other contributions. Yeah. Okay. Questions, comments from the floor?
Well, maybe I can just say something to that, because I think during the election when Bernie Sanders was still a viable candidate, there was great ethnographic work that was done that went into Trump camps and Bernie Sanders camps, and they found that those individuals that were supporting both candidates addressed or voiced the same concerns, right? So they addressed the same problems. They felt that these were the problems that they wished their candidate to speak to. I think the fundamental difference is how that was to be ameliorated, how it was to be repaired. So for Bernie Sanders folks, it was internal. How do we deal with these issues as a nation, as a country? And for the Trump candidates, it is, and this does speak a little bit to what the gentleman just said, it was about the other. And how do we actually rectify that by dealing with the other, whether it's the immigrant or somebody who is receiving welfare. So there is something to that, but I think right now it's a chance to kind of move beyond that discourse and figure out what we are actually going to do to create that identity that we spoke about before.
I think that's a point that you've made, and I know, Charlotte, your work is also engaging with.
Yeah, and I think I'm interested in this idea of making more room in the tent, I suppose, for a diversity of views, particularly around things, I think, around reproduction, around sexuality, around these more complicated, entangled issues around race. And I'm wondering, Larry, I suppose, how you think we could, what is the process by which room in the tent could be made in terms of not, I suppose, bringing ideas or practices that we might find ugly into the tent, and by ugly I mean discriminatory.
Oh, okay, I'll take that, but I just want to make one quick point in response to the point that was made there, and it's one that bears repeating in terms of the racial divide and racial fault lines. One thing that just keeps getting ignored, and I think it's an astonishing thing, is that regardless of all the things Donald Trump said about Latinos in the 2016 election, the reality is that almost 30% of self-defined Latinos voted for Donald Trump, which is an extraordinary statistic, and also in terms of the future of the Democratic Party, in the sense that demographics are going to overwhelm everything and lead to a Democratic future. If, as one political science theorist has speculated, Hispanic Americans are more like Irish Americans than African Americans in their political leanings, the problems facing the Democratic Party might be considerably greater than some say. Now, in response to that question, I think it's fairly straightforward. I mean, look, the Democratic Party is a left-of-center party. Its party platform is going to be left-of-center. It's going to be pro-choice, for instance, on the issue of abortion. However, what I think needs to be done, and Neil mentioned this a minute ago, is not to let the perfect be the enemy of the good. In that sense, so for instance, to put it bluntly, the likes of Nancy Pelosi couldn't get elected dog catcher in Oklahoma. A Democrat running in Oklahoma is going to have substantially different positions, in particular on cultural issues, than a San Francisco Democrat. And the issue here has to be the Democratic National Committee, which cannot allow the likes of the National Abortion Rights Action League and other left-wing groups dictate to it who is acceptable and who is not acceptable. The tent has to be bigger if it's going to be a truly 50-state party.
Yeah, interesting. Oh, I see a hand at the back there.
Hello, my name is Joe Caulfield. I'm a registered Republican originally from New York, living in Offaly. The whole premise of this conversation is based on a form of tribalism, tribal voting patterns, which is that if you're an American of Irish descent, you're expected to vote a certain way. But what if you're not capable of turning on the tribal side of your mindset? What if you're an independent thinker? What if you're capable of assessment, reasoning, logic, and you end up like me, a registered Republican? I wonder would Niall O'Dowd travel all the way from Tipperary to America, start a family, raise his kids, and expect his kids to vote as he wishes, as opposed to vote the way they might choose to vote? You have an answer to that, Niall? Do you have any kids?
Well, my daughter on her 18th birthday enrolled in the Democratic Party. Yeah. So that's all I can tell you. I never had much of a political discussion with her. But you know,
well, look, if you're of Irish descent and you live in America, do you not have the right to make up your mind for yourself?
I've never disputed that right. But all I'm saying is that the Irish-born who go to America, like yourself, a lot of them turn out to be deeply conservative, Irish-born people, which is the kind
by their
of
own choice.
I think you were referring to.
By their own choice, assessment, and logical reasoning, nothing to do with tribalism.
That's the issue that we're trying to think our way through. Yeah, there was a person with their hand up there, just a couple of rows ahead. Yeah.
Try and get this short. First of all, I think he's a crook, and I think he offends.
Who are you referring to, sorry?
And he owes people a lot of money. He's stolen money off people with these university things. He's offended every race, every women horrendously. Yesterday there was 25 or 55 people killed in Israel because of him. And I just, I studied public and social policy, but I just wonder how on earth, and what do you think the effect of his position in America, how it's going to affect the morality of the entire nation? Because if it was in Ireland and Michael D. Higgins behaved like he did, maybe it's a bad comparison, because I don't know if it is or not, but if he did behave like that, he'd be ran out of office. So I cannot understand for the life of me, as somebody who is interested in politics, how on earth he got in ethically, even was allowed even to stand by the Republicans for a position like that of influence.
Yeah, maybe those who are living in the U.S. might like to comment on that, what your prognostications are. But do you think that there will be a sea change in the midterms or in another context too?
Well, as other people pointed out, there already has been, right? I'm not sure if I was complacent before 2016, but I certainly wasn't actively working with groups to come up with small donations to support local candidates in different states. You may know that we had there are two states, New Jersey and Virginia, that have off-year elections. So they Virginia was one of these states that went from being, what, 2/3 Republican to basically it's a split house, right? The Democrats almost got control of the state house. So I think that there's a sense of new vigilance, of mistakes made, not simply that, you know, that winning by almost 3 million votes doesn't guarantee the presidency, and so you have to do everything you can to make sure that somebody like Trump doesn't get the nomination again or become president. But I'm optimistic in that sense. I mean, I do think that there's I don't know what happened in Pennsylvania today, but the fact that everybody is talking about the state of the country and that it's sort of our country and it can't be held hostage, which is what it feels like. And late night comedy has been terrific.
I see the New York Times effectively covers that. That's part of the news, in effect, interestingly enough. I see a hand up there, and I'll come back to you.
Hi, Catherine Anfield. I'm a lecturer here at NUI Galway. Really enjoyable speeches. And Maureen, you mentioned about the sepia thing, and I find myself thinking, is this all uniquely Irish, or are the Irish immigrants like my aunt and my uncle from different sides of the family, are they any different to the baby boomers who voted for Brexit with the sepia idea of what their country used to be like?
You mean the immigrants?
So say the Irish Americans who went in the 40s, 50s and 60s who are now voting Republican and are
they were
that idea of last one in pulls the ladder up.
Right. We call those states that Trump won the flight over states, the Brexit states, some of them. And I think there are a lot of similar qualities. And, you know, to continue on her point, I think the biggest question, and I like to call Trump the Rosemary's Baby of social media, reality TV, and politics. And the biggest question in American politics is, will people be so addicted to all this adrenaline and to this guy taking a bat to normal conventions that they'll want to somehow continue with that? And that's why names like Mark Cuban and Oprah come up. And so will they only want a celebrity president who's unconventional, or will he cause them to scurry back to the conventional? And I don't think we know the answer to that yet, but I agree with you. I mean, I think he's brought an enormous amount of passion into the country, with people either defining themselves in opposition to him and, all of these sort of institutions that had gotten very, lazy in, their expression, have been revivified, like feminism. So we have the most number of women that have ever run. Unfortunately, a lot of them are facing incumbents, so we don't know what will happen. But people are either defining themselves in opposition to Trump, or, he reached his highest poll numbers this week with 42%. So some people who wanted to elect Rottweiler, are happy with the Rottweiler.
Yeah, thank you. There's a gentleman in the front row. If you could wait just a moment for the mic. You'll get there. We'll get there in a moment. But we have just time for this question, and then we'll have our reception. Thank you.
Thank you. Noel Flynn, worked in Wisconsin as a medic. I just wanted to know, the Irish president, or the presidents of the United States visiting Ireland, visited for a reason, we might think cynically here. What influence does Ireland have at all in the United States now? And do you think it's important that we should have an American ambassador in Ireland?
Neil and I covered Obama's trip to Montreal, which was really interesting because the weather was bad, and so they were afraid to use the helicopter. The Secret Service told him he didn't want to, but at that point, the whole trip was arranged, and Obama didn't want to disappoint anyone. The pub was waiting. The whole little town had been repainted. You could smell fresh paint. And so he insisted, and apparently you know, everyone was so terrified on this rough helicopter ride. You know, Obama hardly ever drinks anything, and he just chugged down his Guinness because it was really a close call. But, you know, I talked to the ambassador about this speech. I went over and talked to him, and you know, we were talking about this, and I said, you know, if I were Ireland, I would stop the tradition of just coming to America on St. Patrick's Day to bring a bowl of shamrocks. I mean, I feel like Ireland has moved past that. That's such a caricature in a way, you know? And you know, he was saying, yeah, you're right, maybe. And I said, why don't you just ask the American president not connected with the bowl of shamrocks? And he was saying, yeah, maybe if, you know, he comes, if he goes somewhere and he's refueling in Shannon. And I was like, no, you know, those are the things.
I don't think we want Trump in Ireland.
Oh yeah, well, I don't know. I mean, he
owns a lot of property.
Yeah, he owns a lot of property.
But I mean, there's a confusing signal sent from Ireland. I'll give you an example. 2 weeks before St. Patrick's Day, the Foreign Minister, Simon Coveney, came to America. We had lobbied hard for a special envoy to go into Northern Ireland and try and help like George Mitchell did. And Coveney did a great job getting Tillotson, who was then the Foreign Secretary, to agree. 2 weeks later, the Taoiseach comes in and says, no, we don't need an envoy. So it's very hard when that happens to be able to crack. I mean, we have good friends in the Trump White House. Mulvaney would be the main guy that the Irish government goes to. And there are issues like Brexit and the North and that we need American input on. But as regards to Clinton or the Trump White House, they seem to not see the world at all as important other than North Korea and Israel as far as they're concerned. The lack of an ambassador is absolutely shameful. But we're not the only country. I think there's about 30 countries that don't have an ambassador almost a year and a half into his presidency. So I think the reality is that, you know, Maureen's right. It's nice for the pageantry on St. Patrick's Day, but nothing gets done, particularly on immigration, which is a strong issue with me.
I think it's now time to bring things to a close because we have a reception waiting upstairs. I want to thank our participants, but first to give some thanks to people who made this event happen, to Liz McConnell, who's the Director of Public Affairs in the Office of the President, to Lorna Farron, who is Director of Marketing and Communications, and to her colleagues, Grant O'Sullivan, Michelle Cronin, and Breed Shoga in the Moore Institute, to Martha Shaughnessy and Marie Nevin, and the President's Office, Claire Walsh, to our President, Kieran Huggerty, and to our former President, Dr. Jim Brown. Thank you, all of you, for being here. It's been a fascinating evening. I've learned a great deal. It's opened my mind to a lot of different issues, and I really appreciate your turning out for this event. I just want to thank all of our participants.